record. And you're on.
Continue. Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Medoc. Welcome to Bordeaux. It's been a beautiful day here. I'm Mary Dardenne, as Chris said. I'm here talking to you about the Medoc today in particular. And what gives me the right to talk about Medoc? First of all, I was born in San Antonio, Texas, so not far from where you guys are. Grew up mostly in the States, and when I came to France, knew nothing about wine. So the first thing I want to tell you is please do ask questions, send in your chat, and Chris can, if we have time at the end, Chris can hopefully field those questions, and I can answer a few when I'm finished. I've got a lot of material to get through, so I'm going to have to talk very, very fast, and I apologize for that in advance. But what gives me the right to talk about Bordeaux wines is I went off and I did a diploma in enology. It's not the enology, the DNO to become an enologist, but it's a diploma in tasting given by the Bordeaux enology faculty. So we studied viticulture, viniculture, the science around wine, just pretty much everything. I also teach for the CIBB, which is the Bordeaux Wine Marketing Board, and I lecture for the Wines of the Medoc, which is what we're here to talk about today. So let me just share my screen with you and see if we can get that done. Can you see that okay? Is that on? All righty, let me get rid of that. So what we're going to learn a little bit about Bordeaux in general today, but particularly one area of Bordeaux called the Medoc. So if you haven't been to Bordeaux yet, I suggest you come, because physically being in any wine region, you learn so much more just by being there, as you will know if you've been to Napa or any of the other regions. So today we're going to paint a picture of what the Medoc really is. First of all, I want to try and ask you, let me see if I can get this to work, ask you a question. Generally, when I'm doing this in person, I have you shout out answers to me, but what comes to mind when you think of Bordeaux? Now, what I'm talking about is Bordeaux, the region, Bordeaux, the wines. What do you think of when you think of Bordeaux? Well, I'm going to give you the answer, because if you haven't been to Bordeaux yet, you might have an image of what it's like. So if you think a minute about that. Some people think of great whopping chateaus. Yes, we do chateau in Bordeaux, and we do them well. Not quite like the Loire Valley, but we do chateaus. Some people think of blends. We blend our wine. That's just what we do. And Cabernet blends. Bordeaux is all about the blends. We'll get into that in a moment. A lot of people think it's expensive. One thing you might think is that our wines are long aging. You can't open them up too soon. Some people might think they're old fashioned, stuffy, fuddy-duddy. Well, I'm here today to get you guys to think again and to think differently about Medoc wines in particular, and Bordeaux wines. We do have old fashioned chateau, but we also have a lot of innovation. We have a lot of innovative architecture. We also have the ISVV, the Bordeaux Enology faculty, where I studied, is one of the first and foremost research institutes in France. So we do a lot of, we do have a lot of innovation and research. First of all, let's look at Bordeaux as a whole. It's a very large place, over 273,000 acres. We reason in hectares. So if you hear people thinking of hectares, double it, add a bit, and you get acres. But it's 273,000 acres, about 5,660 wine growers as of 2018. It's the largest fine wine area in France. It's about 5.5 times the size of Burgundy and 2.5 to 3 times the size of the Rhone. This here is a map of the Bordeaux appellations. We have 65 appellations, and for those of you who may not know what an appellation is, they're geographically delimited areas which portray a certain typicity. They're defined by terroir, soil, climate, microclimate, a lot of different factors, but it's what defines the wines and the style of wines in Bordeaux. The appellation is all important in Bordeaux. It's all about location, location, location when you get to Bordeaux wines. It's where you're located that counts in terms of style of wine, the grape varieties you plant, and how you tend your vines. We'll get into all of that in a moment. So this concept of appellation started in 1936. This is it's our quality control charter, really. Wine appellations have had to conform to stricter rules as we've gone along, to be followed by the wine professionals at all stages of the wine, everything from the grape growing to the bottling. So the 20th century for us is all about rules and regulations. New legislation and quality protection led in 1936 to the creation of the INAO, and in English it's the National Institute of Appellations of Origin. So there are 65 appellations in Bordeaux alone, as I said, and it was what originally started in Châteauneuf-du-Pape by Baron Leroy. He initially started it. If you think about what an appellation is, it's a bit like the US political districts, gerrymandering districts, drawing lines around geographical areas. So when we think appellation, think geography, it's location, okay? Because a lot of people confuse appellation with classification. We'll talk about the classifications later. What does appellation mean? Je m'appelle Mary. My name is Mary. It's just a place name. So the place name like Margaux, Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, for example, those are some of the appellations in the Medoc. You'll notice, particularly with Bordeaux wines, that it's the area rather than the grape variety that appears on the labels. So it's important to know where the wine comes from. Each appellation has been traditionally governed by rules that have been established by the INAO, and these rules govern the designated geographical area. They dictate what our grape varieties are, what alcohol levels we can have, how much sulfur we can use in every single process of the wine, the methods of viticulture, pruning, how closely we can plant our vines together. They set the yields every year. And for example, this year, because we haven't been selling our wine so much because of COVID, they set the 2020 yields much lower. I think it's about 50 hectoliters per hectare instead of 54. So the appellations govern every single aspect of our winemaking. So looking at this map of the appellations, you can see the dots, if you can see my pointer, the dots here next to each of the names indicate what style of wine we make. So we've got reds, dry whites, sweet whites. We've got something called crémant, which is our sparkling wine. You know, it has to be made in Champagne to be called champagne. So we have crémant, red, white, rosé, and sweet white. So we've got a lot of diversity. Just very quickly, you might have heard the term left bank and right bank. This is a good way to explain it. We have two rivers, and I'll go a lot more into the two rivers. We have the Dordogne, which is here on the northern part, and the Garonne River, which is here on the southern part. They join together just about here, and they make the Gironde estuary. And where do we get this right bank and left bank? Well, when you're on a ship and you're going out to sea, the port side or the right-hand side is called the right bank, and the starboard side is called the left bank. So these two regions, the Medoc, this purple region up here, and the Grave region, Grave means gravel, down here, this orange-yellow region, those are all left bank wines. So anything on the right bank, basically this whole green area, which is the Entre-deux-Mers, Saint-Emilion-Pomerol, and the Côte wines up here, these are all right bank areas, okay? So that's what right bank and left bank means. But today we're talking mostly about left bank and the Medoc. The diversity of wines we get in Bordeaux is vast, and particularly we'll see that in the Medoc. The Medoc has had the greatest impact on this reputation we were talking about Bordeaux being old-fashioned, expensive, stuffy, long-aging Cabernet blends. This reputation comes from the Medoc and of being the most expensive wines. This reputation is developed because it's here in the Medoc that we have the notion of grand old chateau. There are chateaux in other places, but the biggest and the most fancy chateaux are in the Medoc. The Medoc is even today where we have the most expensive wines and the most Cabernet blends. It's surprising because the Medoc are the new guys on the block. I like to call them the nouveau riche. They were only really developed after the 17th century, and in Bordeaux, that's new. So we'll need to do a little history lesson first, so bear with me. I'm just going to go into a little bit of the history before we get on to examining the Medoc in detail. But I want to explain to you where this reputation comes from and why the Medoc is responsible. So the first vines in Bordeaux were planted by the Romans down here in the Grave region. Now, Grave, as I said earlier, means gravel. And this is where the best, most expensive wines were coming from until the end of the 17th century. So historically, three things happened to make the Medoc wines so important. The first thing is we've got the Porte de la Lune. Now, the Porte de la Lune is the port of Bordeaux, and Porte de la Lune means the port of the crescent moon. And if you can see right here, if you can see my cursor, right here in Bordeaux, you have a little kind of blip, a little fingernail shape. Now, that's the port of Bordeaux. It was the largest commercial port from the Middle Ages to the 18th century. In Paris, if you think about it, the French crown, they drank Burgundy and Champagne. It was easier to get. To get Bordeaux wines to Paris was really difficult in those days. If it got there at all without being looted, stolen, whatever, it probably would have turned to vinegar by the time it got there. So in Paris, they drank Burgundy and Champagne. So in the Middle Ages, we shipped our wines to England. Why did we do that? It all had to do with the lady we called Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's like what I like to call France's first cougar. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine, and Aquitaine in those days included Bordeaux, and it included the whole Landes forest to the south and all the way up to La Rochelle. So it was the largest duchy in Aquitaine. Largest duchy in France. In 1152, she married a guy called Henry Plantagenet. He just happened to be the son of the King of England. Now, a couple of months after their marriage, his father died, making him King of England, therefore making Eleanor Queen of England. And because she gave as a dowry to her husband the region of Aquitaine, the whole region became English territory as of the middle of the 12th century. So the Duchy of Aquitaine, again, was the largest in France. And when this was given to England, the English ruled Aquitaine from England, and it opened up a new market for our wines. The French, needless to say, didn't take very well to part of their country being ruled by the English. The French and the English were rivals from the 11th to the 15th century, and some like to say they're still rivals, particularly with Brexit. But the Gascons, as the French people in this region were called, the French people who were under English rule were called Gascons. They didn't like the French crown for a lot of reasons, but particularly because they drank Burgundy and Champagne and not Bordeaux. So the majority of wine was shipped out to England. It was so much easier to put it on boat and to ship it across the Channel Tunnel. The English Channel, than it was to get it up to England, to Paris. So this accounts for the abundance of Bordeaux wines in England at the time in the Middle Ages. So at this time, the sales of Bordeaux wines represented the largest volume of commercial traffic going through this port in medieval times. And this port of Bordeaux was absolutely buzzing. So as the popularity of Bordeaux wines increased, the vineyards expanded to accommodate the demands from abroad. And at that time, the English were still Catholic and they consumed a lot of wine. Bordeaux effectively became England's cellar. The export of Bordeaux was halted by the outbreak of what they called the 100 Years' War between France and England. It started in 1337, so the beginning of the 14th century, and it ended in 1453. And it ended not far from Bordeaux. It ended right next to Saint-Emilion at the Battle of Castillon. So 1453, France took back the province and taking control also of the wine production in the region. So the French did a very, very clever thing. The English, when they ruled this area, they had put in a tax called the Bordeaux privilege, or the Privilège de Bordeaux. It was a tax on any wines coming through the port of Bordeaux from upriver. So anybody not in Bordeaux had to pay this tax. In the 14th century, under English rule, only about 14% of the wines benefited. In the 15th century, over half of all wines sold benefited from this tax break. And the French, keeping that in place, kept the Gascons, the people from Bordeaux, loyal to the French crown. This also meant that the local Bordeaux population became very, very wealthy. So with the loss of this English demand for our wines when the French took over, we went searching for a new market. And this is the first time the Dutch step in. Now, we love the Dutch in France, particularly in Bordeaux. They're responsible for other things, but a lot of things in Bordeaux. But one of the first things was that they, at the time, they liked the German sweet white wines. And at that time, we produced predominantly white wines. I don't know if you know that. It was only up until the 1950s that we were predominantly white wine and a lot less red wine. So they liked the white wines that we had to produce. They had colonies, they had ships. So they bought up a lot of their wines and they shipped it out and traded it in the colonies. What they didn't send to the colonies was distilled in Holland. So later in the 16th century, the trade with the West Indies opened up and we exchanged wine and eau de vie for sugar and spices. In the 17th century, this area we call the Medoc. Now here we go, you have Bordeaux at the bottom and you can see the whole purple and pink area. That's the Medoc region. It's a peninsula, as you can see, which is surrounded by water. It was very, very marshy, very low-lying and very marshy. So the King Henry IV of France in the early 17th century, again, asked the Dutch engineers to drain the Medoc. The Dutch knew all about being low level and they knew all about draining canals. So they came in and drained out the canal purely so we could cross this area and get across this land without getting malaria and get up here to the top where we've got the port of La Rochelle is just north up here and they just wanted to get across it. Had nothing to do with wine or vine growing at the time. So there weren't many vines planted up there in this area at the time. And once the area was drained, they realized it was quite good grape growing land and very similar to the Grave region where the best wines were coming from. And so these wealthy merchants who were making a lot of money trading started planting extensively throughout the area. Now you can see this is one of the canals, which is still there to this day. And in a little bit, we'll see a film which shows you a lot of the canals. And it's a very good kind of aerial view of where all the canals are. So the rich merchants planted vines and they started growing lots and lots of vines and they started building great chateaux. And it's particularly in the Medoc. This is where they built the chateau and made them more and more extravagant to show off their wealth. So another thing that happened in history was a guy called Arnaud de Pontac, who just happened to be the happy owner of Chateau Aubryon in Pessac. In the 17th century, he started experimenting with new winemaking techniques. Up until then, the wines coming out of Bordeaux were called clairé or clear wines. Clair means clear, and clairé is like a dark rosé. It's in between a dark rosé and a light red wines. And this is where we get the term claret from, because as General de Gaulle said, English is just badly pronounced French. The English didn't know how to pronounce clairé, so they called it claret, which is, in case you don't know, claret is the term for a Bordeaux blend. Mostly used by the English. So this guy, Arnaud de Pontac from Aubryon, started using sulfur in his barrels. Again, due to the Dutch beer makers gave him this little tablet of sulfur, and we call it the Dutch match. We burn it in our wooden barrels and it keeps, it kills the bacteria and keeps the wine from spoiling. He also was experimenting with a lot of other techniques and the wines became more and more powerful with more and more structure. So he was also innovative in marketing terms. He sent his son to London to open up a pub called Pontac's Head, where he direct marketed his wines. His wines were different from the clarets that we had produced before, and the English started calling it the New French Claret. And it became very, very popular. So just to recap, 17th century, the new land becomes available. This is where the wealthy merchant class with deep pockets and a new style of wine becoming more and more increasingly popular. So the merchants bought huge plots of land, started planting vineyards and large chateaux, building large chateaus. The wines were exported even more than before. And in comes the 18th century, which is what we call the golden age. So this was when a lot of the buildings in downtown Bordeaux were built. It's a very prosperous time for the region. As you can see in the picture on the right, you've got all the well-to-do merchants walking along the riverside. And it was all due to the Medoc wines. Now, the Medoc region is what most people know when they think of Bordeaux wine today. Why? Most of it is because of this 1855 classification. Now, this is one of the brochures that I have sent to you, and part of it is right here on the left of your screen. This classification of 1855, I'll tell you how it came about. It's not the only classification of our wines, but it was the first, and it's probably to this day the most important. In 1855, Napoleon asked the wine merchants of the time to set up a ranking order for the best wines to be shown at the Universal Exhibition. It's kind of like your World's Fair or the Iowa State Fair, that kind of thing, which happens every year in Paris. So the wine merchants had only a couple of months to draw up this list, and they based it on price and popularity. Which wines were selling for a premium price and which wines were selling the most. And they drew up a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So first classified growth being the best, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And if you can see on this brochure here, you've got the première, which is first, second, troisième is third, and the fourth and the fifth. It's easy enough to remember the 5 first classified growths: Chateau, Lafite, Rothschild, Mouton Rothschild, Latour, Margaux, and of course, Haut-Brion. He made it into the classification. So the wines of Bordeaux were classified, but not all of Bordeaux was classified. 61 red wines, and 60 of those red wines came from the Medoc. One in Pessac-les-Oignons was Haut-Brion. So Haut-Brion is just next to Bordeaux, closer to, it's not in the Medoc. 26 white wines, and those were the sweet white wines from Sauternes. So it didn't include everybody. So the Medoc had quickly established itself in just under about 150 years. They established itself as the go-to place for red Bordeaux. And they've kept this reputation to this day. So this classification is relatively unchanging, or is it? Some of you may know about one time recently that it changed. Chateau Mouton Rothschild had its position revised. I'm not going to speculate on how they did that, but in 1973 they were bumped up from a second to a first. But only one other time it's been changed, and this was only 3 months after its inception. A lady who owned Chateau Cantemerle in 1855, she was able to prove that her wines were selling for as much as, and in quantity and price, as the other 5th classified growth. So she was able to get into the classification. So we now have other classifications of the Medoc, which we'll talk about in a moment, which you can see on labels. Cru Bourgeois of the Medoc, classified in 1932, and Cru Artisan classified in 2006. So in a relatively short span of time, the Medoc took over as the go-to place for reds. But let's talk about the Medoc today. So we produce more than 100 million bottles per year, and it makes up only about 15% of Bordeaux wines, but that's still a lot of wine. There are, as I said, in all of Bordeaux, 5,660 chateaux, domains, and properties, but not all are great big chateaux. About 1,500 of those are in the Medoc and spread across 8 different appellations. As I said before, the AOC is all about location, and it's all about the place where the wines come from. The area the Bordeaux area has 65 appellations, but 8 are in the Medoc. So we have just over 40,000 acres, that's 16,200 hectares, of vines planted in the Medoc. There are big variations because of its size. There are lots of small family businesses, as well as large chateaux. So 56% of Bordeaux wine estates are family owned. The average estate size is about 20 hectares or just under 50 acres. And only 5% of these are those classified growths we were talking about a minute ago. And this is not really our normal image that we have of Bordeaux, especially in the US. And we'll find out why. And that is predominantly because Bordeaux is export driven, and the Medoc takes the lead. This is another reason why the Medoc is very well known throughout the world. We are export driven. For Bordeaux as a whole, we export about 44%, the rest serving the domestic market and staying in France. And what we export from the Medoc tends to be the more expensive wines. This increases the image of Bordeaux wines as being expensive. I get my wine for €6 down the road. Sorry, you have to come to Bordeaux to get those kind of prices. But the French tend to drink less expensive wines. Overall, in France, the consumption of wine has dropped. It's dropped about 28% in the past 20 years, and young French people tend to drink more white wine than red. Our biggest export markets are China, the US just behind, and then the UK. So looking at the geography, the Medoc is a peninsula, as we've seen. It's very low-lying and very flat, and it's very marshy. The image you have of rolling hills with a chateau on the top, the hills giving good drainage, sun exposure, air circulation, all that, forget it. The Medoc is as flat as a pancake. The highest point is about 44 meters above sea level. There is a fault line which runs right down the middle of this Gironde estuary that millions of years ago, there was a tectonic plate shift. And it meant that this side, the right bank, so what is the Côte and the Saint-Emilion wines, they are a whopping 114 meters above sea level, whereas the Medoc is very different. It's very, very flat. So over millions of years, water flowing back and forth from these rivers has deposited lots of alluvial materials, clay, gravel, and silt. So I mentioned our two rivers in Bordeaux, the Garonne and the Dordogne River. They join together to make the Gironde estuary, flowing out to the Atlantic Ocean. The Garonne River is the principal river. Its source is in the Pyrenees to the southeast. Over the time, these rivers have risen and receded. The water's gone back and forth over many years, leaving gravel deposits, creating what we call gravel outcrops. Or in French, if anybody wants to study the MW, you're going to have to learn this word, coupe, C-R-O-U-P-E-S, gravel outcrops. They consist of lots of pebbles, mostly quartz, very bright and very white. The colored area on the map here is the only area where the vines are planted. Further to the west over here, we've got great surfing beaches, but it's all filled with sand, marine sand, and that's not great for grape growing. So Napoleon III planted pine trees all along this coast and down here in the Landes forest, and he planted them to avoid erosion, and also that forest protects us from coastal storms and the winds. So key things to remember: the soil is gravel, it's low-lying, we have a forest protecting us from storms and the ocean, which adds to our microclimate. It's a narrow band of vines. You can see here just 2 to 5 kilometers wide and about 70 to 80 kilometers long. It's sandy on the western side, marine sand, so no good for vine growing. Great surfing beaches though. Elevation is about 44 meters. We'll see that more in a moment at its highest point, and about anywhere from 3 to 10 meters here along the estuary. So a narrow band of flat vineyards. So within the AOC, as again, 65 appellations in Bordeaux, in the region we call the Medoc region, we have 2 regional appellations and 6 village appellations. We'll delve deeper into each appellation in a moment, and I'm just going to try and play this video. Let's see if I can get this to play. Let me know if you can't see the video. Is that coming through okay? I'm assuming it is. Okay, so you've got France and all the vineyards. You've got Bordeaux in the southwest corner. You can see Bordeaux as a town, and the purple area, which is the Medoc and the Medoc vineyard. So starting from the northern point of the Medoc, just opposite La Rochelle, down there at the Atlantic Ocean, we're going to go through and see the elevations, and you'll be able to see all of the appellations, which will be in color. The Medoc right there, the white names are the town names, okay? So you've got the Medoc appellation right up at the top. You can see all the drainage ditches coming down towards the Gironde estuary. We've got Saint-Estèphe, where you've got 16 meters, 27 meters in Pauillac, 23 meters in Pauillac. You can see some of the drainage ditches there. Saint-Julien-Bechevel, we're going south towards the town of Bordeaux. Au Medoc, The Haut Medoc goes from north to south, east to west. It covers pretty much all of the Medoc. So you really need to know where you are. And here we're coming into Margot. You can see the islands. We've got a couple of islands there, the Ile de Pateras and the Ile de Margot, Mâcon, Loudun, Medoc. Those are all Haut Medoc vines, and the town of Bordeaux. And we'll go just back up quickly on the western side. You can see how close to the beach we are. So it's a very, very narrow band of vines. So that's Haut Medoc, which is closer, haut, meaning high, higher up the river, closer to Bordeaux. And you can see just behind Margot, you've only got 4 meters, 3 meters there. That's the 3 meters above sea level, so very flat. Listrec Medoc, you've got 39 meters. Haut Medoc, again, Saint-Julien going further north. I think this is a very good way to get kind of the lay of the land. I normally put this on as students are filing in for the class. So this is obviously a very, very different way of looking at it. So here we are right up at the top. So you get closer to the point of the Medoc where there's lots and lots of sand and clay up there. So after the furthest bit in the Medoc, you get no more vines. So that's a very quick run through of the topography. So let's talk about climate. We have a temperate climate. We're on the 45th parallel, which is equivalent to kind of Vermont or Montana on the Canadian border. We're halfway between the North Pole and the equator. And we're at the northernmost limit where Cabernets will ripen. But all that's changing with global warming. We'll talk about that in a moment. Our Atlantic climate means it rains a lot. So if the drainage isn't coming from the slopes, it has to come from the soil. And you can see that gravelly soil. So with all the rain we get, we're really good at doing rot, mildew, and oidium. Cab vines are a very tightly packed bunch of grapes, and they don't like their roots in water. So we need good drainage. We need that hydric stress for them to develop properly and to have the freshness we want. So soil here is the key. Since we're low-lying, the gravel deposits allow the vines to thrive. So you may ask, if it's so difficult to get the cabs to thrive here, why not just plant more Merlot? Well, we believe that in order for cabs to ripen properly with the complexity that we want, we need a long, slow ripening period. As I said, we're at the northern limit on the 45th parallel to allow us this long, slow ripening without losing the freshness and acidity, which gives elegance to our wines. Bordeaux has a relatively cool climate at night, particularly. Cool climate allows the complexity to develop in the skins without producing too much sugar and therefore too much alcohol. To achieve this, it has to be planted on gravel because the gravel provides drainage. It also heats up. It holds the warmth of the sun because it's quite warm in the daytime. And then as it cools down, it reflects that sun at night, allowing for this long, slow ripening. So the word Medoc comes from in medio aqua, which means we're surrounded by water, in the middle of the water. This creates our microclimate. We have a temperate, warm, and humid climate during the day, which is reinforced by being on the Gulf Stream. Saint-Emilion, just to the east of us, has a much bigger variation in temperature, day to night and winter to summer. The sea breezes allow the tightly packed bunches of Cabernet to dry off, helping us prevent oidium, mildew, and rot, which we're really good at here in Bordeaux. The Atlantic climate is lovely, humid, and wet during the day, and the sea breezes helps the vines dry out, reducing the effect of rot. So just while we're on the subject of climate, let's take just a minute to talk about what Bordeaux is doing in terms of climate change. And this is Bordeaux as a whole. There are several observations of the effects of climate change: increase in the average of temperatures with continued pronounced vintage effect, a shorter vine growing cycle, earlier ripening. It's been approximately 20 days earlier over the past 30 years. So for more than 20 years, the Bordeaux vineyards have been following collective approaches organized by the CIVB, again, which is our main wine governing board and marketing council. We've been controlling and improving the environmental impact from the vines all the way down to the consumers. So we're adapting our vineyard practices to combat the change, and these strategies come into play for every vintage or at the time of each planting. So we're trying to protect biodiversity, reducing the use of pesticides. Wherever you go, people always talk about reducing the use of chemicals, better control of our carbon footprint, and reducing water and energy consumption. We do this by delaying pruning dates, increasing the trunk height, limiting leaf thinning, rethinking plot sizes, reducing the plant density, all sorts of ideas in how to put these plans into effect. There's something called the 2020 plan, which should be called the 2020, but they want to reduce by 20% overall greenhouse gases by a 20% reduction in power, 20% reduction in water savings, and a 20% creation of renewable energy. They're encouraging great variety diversification, especially those resistant to climate change. In fact, just last year, the winemakers voted to approve 7 new grape varieties to be allowed in the Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur appellations only. This does not concern the Medoc, only Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur wines. But these 7 new grape varieties are expected to be voted by the INAO very, very shortly. They can only make up to 10% of the final blend and 5% of a producer's planted vineyard area. I won't go into them exactly, you can look them up, but it's very exciting that Bordeaux is in fact changing. So here are just a few of our labels, as you call them. These are the certifications we have for organic, sustainable. We have more than 60% of our vineyards in Bordeaux are involved in the environmental approaches certified by one of these regimes above. The goal is 100% by 2025. Again, with it being so hot and humid here, it's very, very difficult to produce a wholly organic wine. So a lot of people are what they call HVE or HEV, high environmental value. So in 2017, about 200 estates were HEV. We also have EMS and ISO, which is the International Standards Organizations. The AB is our organic, Terra Vitis and Demeter are 2 regulatory bodies. But these are labels which you'll see sometimes on the label, sometimes not. So back to the terrain and the soils of the Medoc. The soils of the Medoc, we already mentioned the gravel, where a series of gravel outcrops, but here you can see how the rivers flowing back and forth over millions of years, they rose and they receded. They deposited alluvial materials, and as they receded, they created these troughs, creating these gravel outcrops or croup. To make it even more complicated, we've got 2 types of gravel because we're very serious about our gravel here. This is a good picture to show you the Dordogne River, the Garonne River, and where they join to make the Gironde estuary is just about at Margaux. So Margaux is right where these 2 join. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The 2 rivers, the Pyrenees gravel, we have 2 types of gravel. The Pyrenees gravel coming from the Pyrenees mountains, funnily enough. This comes in from the Garonne River, which is the southernmost river. It has its source in the Pyrenees, which is to the southeast of us, along the Spanish border. This gravel was brought in from the mountains. It's an older gravel, it's smaller, it's pinker, and this makes a difference because it's darker. It's deposited in a narrow band along this western side of the vineyards. Here the elevation is a little bit higher, 44 meters at its highest, and it's also closer to the forest here. The next type of gravel we have is Garonnais gravel, or it's sometimes called Gunsian gravel because of the time period it was brought in by. It's been deposited along the riverbed, mostly by the Dordogne River. It's brighter, it's whiter, it's bigger pebbles, and that means it makes for a better drainage. It's also warmer soils. This is where you get the big concentration of Cabernets along here. We'll see that when we go into each individual appellation. So the conditions are perfect for growing cabs where you get this Garonnais gravel. The next type of soil we have is clay and limestone mixed in with the gravel. Dig deep anywhere in Bordeaux and you'll find limestone. Everything was under the ocean at one time. So on top of the limestone, we have clay. deposited with these alluvial materials. So in the Medoc, we have this mixture of soil, gravel, clay, limestone. And so we have a mixture of blends. This is why we blend our wines. That's just what we do in Bordeaux, and particularly in the Medoc, because we have this mixture of soil. As we've seen, Bordeaux is a big place. The average vineyard size is about 20 hectares, or just over 40 acres. Within each vineyard, you can have a variety of soils. So the decision about what we plant, the grape varieties we use, do not depend on the wine I feel like making for my clients or the range of varietals I want to give. The decision depends on the soil. The soil dictates to the winemakers. So you have a variety of soils, you have a variety of grape varieties to choose from. We're legally limited to 6 main grape varieties in the Bordeaux region. Again, not counting those new 7 ones. Yes, we can plant Shiraz or Pinot Noir, but you cannot call it Bordeaux. It'll be called Vin de France or table wine. So our 6 main grape varieties are Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Carmenère, and Malbec. The first 4 are the ones we see most in the Medoc. You have to look very far to find Carmenère, but we do have some. So we blend in Bordeaux, and particularly in the Medoc. So you will find Cabernets elsewhere in Bordeaux, but here in the Medoc, Cabernet is the king. It's the highest percentage of Cabernet is planted in the Medoc because it's here where we have gravel. That's right. The gravel allows these small skinned black fruit to ripen slowly, as I've said before. It gives powerful structure to the black fruits. It's full of black currant, blackberries, blueberries, peppery, spicy aromas. That's what we associate with the cabs. So Merlot is the second. We'll see the percentages planted in a moment, but you do get Merlot elsewhere, but it's also planted in great quantity in the Medoc. It doesn't always get good press in the US, but if you've had a good Pomerol recently, you know that there's nothing wishy-washy about our Merlots. We've been growing Merlot for a long time. It loves clay, and we have a lot of clay on the right bank in Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. That's where you find the highest percentage planted, but we still have a lot of clay in the Medoc as well. So the wines are rounder, sweeter. It's all about, the Merlot is all about ripe red fruit, strawberry, raspberry jam, more sugar, so more alcohol. Cabernet Franc is our next grape variety. Cabernet Franc really likes the limestone. So you think Loire Valley or Saint-Emilion, that's where we get big concentrations of Cab Franc. You will find a little bit in the Medoc, not too much, not as much as the 2 previous grape varieties. So again, spicy notes, raspberry adds a bit of tannic structure. Petit Verdot. Petit Verdot is a complicated one. It's difficult to ripen, particularly in Bordeaux, as we're so far north. It's a later ripening grape variety, but it's increasing in popularity. Before, we only had about 2 to 4% planted in all of Bordeaux. Now we have about 12 to 15%. Why? Global warming. Well, we saw that just a moment ago, in part, but it's also due to other factors. In 2000, it was planted on about 926 acres in the Bordeaux region. In 2018, 2,701 acres were planted with Petit Verdot. That's an increase of about 191%. In the blends, it offers slightly tannic touch to the violet and licorice notes. But why are we planting more? Because today we have a much better understanding about the grape varieties in relation to the soil. We have a lot of toys that we can use today to tell us about the soil. We take not just carrot samples where you take a plug out and you look at the different levels of the soil. We can take satellite images, we send electric shocks into the vines, we measure water counts yearly. There are lots of ways to analyze the soil today. And all of this goes back to something that happened in 1956. 1956, there was a catastrophic frost. Not unlike 2017, where we had a frost and we lost about 40% of our harvest. In 56, we lost 100% of the harvest, but we also lost about 50% of our vineyards. We had to uproot and replant, and it took a long time to do that. It took up until the 1970s to do that. And it was a very long, slow, painful process for the winemakers. The economic situation in 56 was very, very different. They were just coming out of the Second World War. They were economically stressed. The vines planted at the time were 60% white varieties. Remember I said we used to have more white. Today, we're only about 11% white and 89% red in all of Bordeaux. So replanting took some time, and the Chamber of Commerce at the time advised the people to plant Cabernet. Why? Because Cab ripens later, it buds later, it harvests later, it's frost resistant. So plant Cab they did, and they planted it everywhere. They planted it on clay, on limestone, in places where it shouldn't have been planted. So this is one of the reasons why we get this image of Bordeaux, that you can't drink a Bordeaux wine young, and that you're obliged to age them. People are always asking me, when can I drink my Bordeaux wine? Well, you know, it depends on your taste, but now is a good time. So this image comes from the time when grapes were planted in areas where they wouldn't ripen properly, and particularly Petit Verdot and Cabernet Sauvignon. They were green, herbaceous, and I don't know if you know about a Cabernet harvested under ripe, you can have very green, herbaceous, green peppery notes coming out of it. So that it was a long time coming. And all of that's changed now. 66% of Bordeaux vines are planted with Merlot, 22% Cabernet Sauvignon, and 9% Cabernet Franc. We're making lighter, fruitier wines. You can still keep our Bordeaux wines, particularly the Medoc wines, and they'll get even better and better, but you no longer have to hold on to them. So if you have any Bordeaux in your cellar or in your fridge, start drinking it now. All of that just to say that the proportions of Petit Verdot were planted that we planted today are growing because we know so much more about how to get them to ripen. So here's our map again. And as our knowledge of soil increases, the plots we have get smaller and smaller. Remember I said that in any one vineyard, you can have a lot of different types of soil. You used to have a large area of Merlot over there, a large area of Cab over there, and you know, maybe some Carmenère, maybe some Petit Verdot. Now it's very, very different. We have lots of small precision plots where Merlot thrives and is planted, and other small plots where Cab does extremely well. This is called precision viticulture. It's a function of the soil, and each plot is treated as a separate vineyard and vinified separately. The life cycle of a vine before we uproot and replant is roughly 70 years. And all of our decisions, what variety am I going to plant? How am I going to trellis? When am I going to pick? How am I going to de-leaf? Or am I going to de-leaf? Do I plant a cover crop? All of these decisions are made plot by plot. In the past, when you visited properties, you'd spend a lot of time in the vat room or the barrel cellar. Now they take you straight into the vineyards, and you look at the soil. You talk all about the soil. They show you maps of the vineyards to see how they ripen differently, satellite images of the leaves to see how they mature at different times. This is plot by plot management, or precision viticulture. So the wines are vinified separately, and we're not blending them just yet. The vat rooms today have about 20 to 30 small tanks, each one which is associated with the yield of a particular plot. Before we used to have 3 or 4 big ones, but now we have lots and lots of tiny vats. So the quantities corresponding to the plots. The blending decisions are different every year depending on the climate. We have the vintage effect. The percentage we see planted in the vineyards is not necessarily what is in the bottle, because the blend will change from year to year. It may be better during harvest time for Merlot than the later ripening Cabernet. It starts to rain when we pick the Cabernet. So we could get rot going quickly through our vines. So it's different every year. So we've got the vintage effect to take into account. We've got to contend with what Mother Nature throws at us, and it's different every year. So there's, in the Medoc as a whole, we have 8 appellations, 2 regional and 6 village. If you look at your map, again, we saw it on the flyover. This is the Medoc region up here at the top, the light pink. Au Medoc, Au meaning high, higher up the river, closer to Bordeaux, is the dark purple. And as you can see, it goes north to south, east to west. You have to know where the wine comes from. It could be more like a Saint-Estèphe or more like a Margaux. They're very different. So the 6 village appellations, we're going to go through and see the percentages planted. Now here on the left, This is the Medoc region as a whole, and on the right we'll have each appellation. You can see in the Medoc as a whole, the Medoc region, we're very even with Cabernet and Merlot. The Cabernet is this greeny khaki sort of area, and the Merlot is the pink one. So we have a balance of Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon with very little Cab Franc and just a smattering of the others. So looking at each individual appellation, now these are percentages of grape varieties planted and their averages. They are by no means obligations. Each chateau is free to choose to plant what they want, depending on the soil. So in the Medoc appellation, that one right up at the top here, right up at the top in the Medoc, you've got more Merlot than Cab. It's normal because you've got more clay up there, a little bit more sand. We've got cooler soils, very little influence of that lighter Garonnais gravel, clay, limestone, and a little bit of darker gravel. It's a cooler microclimate, cooler soil, so more Merlot. In Medoc, which again goes north, south, east, west, it's in general closer to the town of Bordeaux, so you got a little bit more gravel, more Cab, but again, you need to know where it comes from in order to know what it might favor. So the Medoc stretches all across the region. You've got deep gravel to the east, the lighter, brighter gravel, and darker gravel to the west. Margaux, going from south to north now on the map, you've got Margaux, which is right on the estuary. Margaux and Saint-Julien, you get a narrow strip along the estuary with lots of Garonnais gravel. So here you've got lots and lots of Cabernet. That's Saint-Julien, 62% planted in Cab and only 30% in Merlot. Pauillac, again, lots of gravel, lots of Cab. Saint-Estèphe, a bit less gravel. You've got more clay and sand up here as you get closer to the tip of the peninsula. So there's a little bit more Merlot up here. Listrac and Moulis, those are along the western side. You've got much more Merlot. You've got more sand towards the west and a lot of that darker Pyrenean gravel. So just to recap, the closer to the estuary you are, the more Garonnais gravel you have, the more Cab you plant. To the west, you get more Pyrenees gravel, the darker and higher elevation. It's closer to the forest. It's got a cooler microclimate, so you get more Merlot. Listrac and Moulis, they're all about the Merlot. So the soil dictates the varietal, which dictates the blend, and the blend will change every year, just to make it more easy. So a quick reminder, Medoc to the north, Medoc to the south, there are two regional appellations, and then the village appellations, Margaux, Moulis, Listrac, Saint-Julien, Pauillac, and Saint-Estèphe. So the Medoc appellation is the largest in surface area, with the Medoc not far behind, and Moulis and Listrac are the smallest. So going through appellation by appellation, in the northern part of the Medoc, you've got the Medoc appellation. It used to be called Bas Medoc. You have Haut, meaning high Medoc, and Bas, meaning lower Medoc. Well, the French don't like anything derogatory associated with their name, so they took out the Bas, and we now just call it the Medoc appellation. It's the largest of all the appellations in the Medoc. There's much more Merlot here in the Medoc appellation. Since you've got a large variety of soils, you get a great diversity of wines. There are three appellations where you get no classified growth, and Medoc is one of them. The reputation has suffered a little bit as a result, but Medoc wines are extremely good value of money. So this is really good for the consumers as they are a lot more affordable. Medoc stretches, again, north, south, east, west. It's very, very long and thin. So the gravelly soils to the waterfront and the sandy soils to the west. Therefore, we have a huge variety of terroirs and a vast variety of wines. I tell people you need to look at the village, find out where it is. Is it closer to Saint-Estèphe or is it closer to one of the other regions? That way you will know a little bit more about what the wine will taste like. So we have a little bit more Cabernet Sauvignon here. Here we do, in Medoc, we do have classified growths and other classifications. In terms of a tasting profile, if you know where the wines come from, some are near Pauillac, Saint-Estèphe, and they'll be more powerful. Others are closer to Bordeaux. They'll be more elegant and feminine, like the Margaux wines. Moulis. Moulis, a lot of people, particularly in the US, these Moulis and Listrac are so small, a lot of people haven't heard of them, but it's just a tiny, tiny sliver of an appellation. We have more Merlot here since we have the cooler clay soils and limestone and the darker Pyrenean gravel here in Moulis. Since we have more Merlot and more sandy soils and the darker gravel, the character of the wine is more fully bodied. The wine here can be a little bit rustic sometimes. Listrac, there's mostly Merlot planted here. It's mostly Garanese gravel, lighter, brighter limestone. Limestone is best in Saint-Emilion, where we have a lot of calcaire asterie. So it's a limestone which is brought in through the being covered by the ocean. It acts like a sponge, soaking up the water and irrigating the vines in warmer weather. Cab Franc is best on the limestone, as we saw earlier. So Listrac is also quite small. They're pretty similar in size, Moulis and Listrac. It's just north of Moulis. So Listrac is called the rooftop of the Medoc. It's the highest point at 44 meters above sea level. Not exactly nosebleed territory, but it's up there. So Listrac has a reputation for being a little bit more rustic. Margaux is along the eastern side of the Medoc. It's driving up the D2 wine route. You go past Château-la-Lagune into Margaux. It's the largest of the village appellations, incorporating 5 other villages. And I like to think of the acronym CLAMS to remember the village. Cantenac, Labarde, Arsac, Macau, and Soussault, CLAMS. So there's 5 villages within the appellation of Margaux. It's very prestigious, and that's all thanks to Chateau Margaux at its center. Now, don't forget, Margaux is an appellation. It's Chateau Margaux, and there's a town called Margaux, so you need to know which one you're talking about. So Chateau Margaux is a first classified growth of the classification of 1855. Classified growths make up 2/3 of the appellation. There are 21 of the classified growths here. This is an area where the Dordogne and the Garonne rivers meet. Because the Dordogne River comes from the Massif Central in the center of France, there's a volcano in the Massif Central, and it brings in lots of volcanic material. And this volcanic sand is very dark, and it mixes with the sand and gravel, and it heats up, and it makes a very peculiar, a very particular terroir, a very particular soil. So it's very different from the other areas because this volcanic sand culminates in just that one place. And so this makes Margaux wines very, very unique. Margaux wines are considered the most feminine wines of the Medoc. Sumptuous, luscious, smooth, round wines are some of the descriptors of Margaux wines. As you go further north, the wines tend to get more powerful. Why? Because you get bigger pebbles, deeper gravel outcrops, more cab. Some of the characteristics of Margaux are lots of floral notes, think potpourri and violets. St. Julien, so leaving Margaux, you cross into the Medoc again, crossing a little stream. You have to drive for about 15 minutes before you get to one of those drainage ditches, which I showed you earlier, which were built in the 17th century. These were sluice gates, and they were rather clever because they would, when the tide came in, they would close and not allow the water in. And when the tide went out, they would open up and allow for the drainage. So at the border of Margaux and St. Julien, you drive past some of these gates, leaving the Medoc and entering into St. Julien. So of the classified growths, there are no firsts and no fifths, but 87% of the production of St. Julien is classified in only 11 vineyards. So these are very high quality wines and very consistent in style. It's the smallest of the village appellation, and it's very, very close to the river. So it's very low lying. But there are 2 big gravel outcrops. It's a very homogeneous soil, so very small and very prestigious. On the outcrops are Chateau Bechevel, a 4th classified growth, and the Léovilles, 2nd classified growths. The outcrops are Garanese gravel, and so they're very deep, very white, very bright, big stone, very well drained, very, very warm. This is Cabernet Sauvignon land. So the tasting profile, there's a myriad of different styles in St. Julien. Some can be powerful and tannic and masculine, like the Chateau Léoville Lascaz or Léoville Barton. Some of the wines from St. Julien can be confused with Pauillac because it's just right next door. Others can be on the elegant and refined side, like Chateau Brenner de Cru. Some chateaux remain traditional in their winemaking, like Chateau Saint-Pierre. Some of you may have seen this before. It's the logo of Chateau Bechevel. It was built by the Duke of Epernon, who was an admiral in the French Navy. He noticed that ships were coming into the port of Bordeaux. They would lower their sail, and he assumed that they were saluting him. If you know anything about sailing, you know that you can't come into a port under full sail. But there's a little sign as you come into the appellation of St. Julian saying, passers-by, you're entering hallowed ground, salute. Well, this is where it comes from, and this is on the label of Chateau Bechevel. So that's kind of fun story. So passing the three Léovilles, Léoville Barton, Léoville Lescaz, and Léoville Poiferré, you go down the side of a gravel slope, and you cross over a little stream, and you come to one of the most beautiful views of all of Bordeaux, and you cross over into Pauillac. So the first thing you see on your right is Chateau Latour, which is one of the first classified growths. And then you see the two Pichons, Pichon Comtesse on the right and Pichon Baron on the left-hand side, sitting on top of these gravel outcrops. This appellation is extremely prestigious because 3 of the 5 first classified growths are here, the 2 Rothschilds, Mouton and Lafitte, and also Chateau Latour. It has a high percentage of classified growths. 85% of the vines are within the classification in 18 properties. So after the 2 Pichons and Latour, the village of Bages on another gravel outcrop. Here you've got Lynch-Bages, Grand Prix-le-Coste, Pontet-Canet just across the street, Mouton and Clermillon, and then Lafitte in the northernmost part of the appellation. There's some plots that were planted here in the 1300s, but it was only after the draining by the Dutch in the 17th century that the vines were planted extensively. The wines have become increasingly popular because they had the added advantage of being nearest to the major port at the time in Pauillac. This was in the day when you had to roll your barrels down the hill and get them onto ships. So they were closest to that port, which is still there today. It's a pleasure port. But they had the advantage of being one of the first exported. So in Pauillac, we have classified growths, we have Cru Bourgeois, Cru Artisan, which we'll get to in just a moment, and non-classified properties, a little bit of everything. These wines are rich, full-bodied, tannic, powerful, cigar box. I always think of lead, pencil, and leather when I think of Pauillac wines. So Saint-Estèphe, after leaving Lafitte and Mouton and Pontet-Canet, you go down a slope and you come across another little stream, a drainage ditch, and then up another hill. And on top of that hill, you come into Saint-Estèphe, and you have Côte-d'Estournel dominating the hillside. You've got 2 enormous outcrops here with a subsoil of limestone. It's quite hilly comparatively, but there are no first growth in this area. In Saint-Estèphe, you've got a lot of smaller properties and the highest number of Cru Bourgeois properties, which we'll talk about in a moment, including some of the exceptional Cru Bourgeois. You've got very good quality, more rustic wines, sometimes chewy tannins, quite edgy. These are characteristics of Saint-Estèphe. One of the ways they're getting around that is by planting more and more Merlot in their blend. There's more gravel over limestone, and this is the key to Saint-Estèphe, giving the wines power and structure. So that's it for the detail of each. I've just got to quickly go through other families of growth, and then we'll wrap it up, and if you've got time for any questions. So not everybody is classified. You've got about 60 properties in the classification. The other classifications are Cru Bourgeois, Cru Artisan, and we've got some Clos, and we've got some other properties which have never been classified. Now the Cru Bourgeois, I'll be very brief on this. It was, it's an ancient term which dates from the 12th century. But these are the people who were from the bourgeoisie, were the people from the town. And these are the people who made the Medoc. These are these wealthy, rich merchants who started planting in the beginning. And they were the ones who were responsible for creating the Medoc. In 1932, it became an official classification, but it was never ratified by the government. So it just became a term of reference. Going quickly ahead to what they are today, it was in 2009 they put into place a new system. Now it is a proper classification, and you have the levels of Cru Bourgeois, Exceptionnel, Supérieur, and Cru Bourgeois. So there are about 249 in these classifications. So you've got a lot of people who are not involved in either of these classifications. And in 2006, we had the Cru Artisan. These are all small family properties. You have to be in control of every single part of your vine making, vine growing, and the commercialization. So in 2017, we had 33 properties involved in that. And now about 8 of the AOC are represented. So only 60% of Medoc wine is Chateau bottled. So 40% of that, some of it will be merchant wine or branded wines. You may have heard of Mouton Cadet or Michel Lynch. Those are juice, which is bought up by the wine merchants and bottled. And then we have the co-ops. So we have about 17,000 hectares, or of which 1,200 are in the Medoc appellation. And these go through co-ops. So the co-ops were formed after the First World War, and they help with any or all of the winemaking, vine growing, or just the commercialization. So we do get some chateau wines coming out of co-ops, and it's not, it can be very good quality of wine. So just as a quick recap, the Medoc is all about the history and the location. It's a very specific microclimate, low-lying, gravelly. It's what we know as the left bank, surrounded by water, coastal winds drying off the grapes, a large diversity of prices, some small family properties, very large chateaus, a little bit of everything, a little bit of every style, and we have the vintage effect. There's lots of reading on the Medoc, medoc.com website. If you have any questions, I can take them now, or you can always send me an email here. Chris, are there any questions? Do we have time to take questions?
Sure, we have time. Anybody have any questions? I know it's a lot of information, and I mean, I know there's a couple of you that always have some good questions. Do they have anything?
If not, you can always send them to me via email. That's not a problem.
I did have one.
Yep.
I heard you describe the Mergo wine as a more feminine wine, and I haven't heard wine described like that before. What are some of the traits that make that considered a feminine wine, I guess?
When you get more Merlot, it becomes more fruity, and you get more Merlot in Margaux than you do, say, in Pauillac or Saint-Estèphe. So the cabs tend to be fuller bodied, bigger, rounder. And down in Margaux, you also have this volcanic sand, which I talked about, which comes in and warms up the soil and creates for a very different terroir. You know this concept of terroir being the soil, the climate, the microclimate, and the hand of man, how we prune and that sort of thing. It's because of this specific soil and the grape varieties that they use tends to be more Merlot and a little bit more floral. It all comes in down to the terroir and the soil, and that's specific volcanic sand, which is only in that Margaux appellation.
Interesting, thank you.
Pleasure. Anybody else?
I have one more. This is more so like interior specialty for the tours. What does a typical tour in Burgundy look like on a given day?
In any of the regions, what you'll do is you'll go to 2 or 3 properties. You said Burgundy. Did you mean Burgundy or Bordeaux?
Oh, Bordeaux. Sorry. Yeah, you're correct.
That's okay. That's okay. I can do both. Sorry. In Bordeaux, it's a technical visit, whereas if you go to Napa, you might have a glass of wine. In Bordeaux, you will go in and you'll hear about, as I said, you'll go straight into the vineyard. You'll talk a lot about the soil, about the climate. They'll tell you more and more, because we're very excited about our sustainability and our environmental factors. So they'll tell you how they're maybe plowing with horses, that sort of thing. You can do 3 to 4 visits in a day. They're very welcoming. They're very open. It can be difficult to get visits, which is why people like me exist. But the properties are definitely open for business, and there's more and more places with restaurants, so combining wine and food pairing, and they're really getting serious about educating the consumer, whereas it used to be they only invited journalists or wine merchants because they were the ones who sell the wines, but now it's very informative, but they're technical visits. So you'll go into the vineyard, then you'll go into the cellar, and you'll hear all about malolactic fermentation and all of that. So you've got to be prepared for a technical visit as opposed to just a glass of wine and told to go walk around the shop like you do in a lot of Napa Sonoma properties. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Not the answer I was expecting, but I guess the perspective of Americanized tourism versus the technical speaking, how you say they do in France. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. Anybody else?
Well, Mary, this has been a delight. Thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
Class, I know it's hard to give a round of applause, but let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry I had to speak so quickly and there's a lot of information.
No, it was fantastic. And Mary, if you ever get to Houston, we would welcome you here to do this face-to-face another time. Also, I've got some first growth back to the early 1900s. If we could open one of those and share and get your thoughts as an insider on some of that. So
great.
We'd love to host you. I will reach out to you and give you particulars on the number of students that we had in this today.
That's fantastic. I'm going to do a screenshot.
Yeah, and I'll get you the link to the presentation so you have that as well. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank everybody for listening, and sorry it went on so long, but there's lots more information, and hope to see you all in Bordeaux or in Houston when we're able to travel again.
Thank you very much.